Hi, everybody. This is Kevin from the Gather Project. For those of you who haven't participated in one of these things before, I think most of you have by now, but check out gatherproject.net. This is a new episode of What's Your Story with Dimitra Tsingou. And I'm really excited to have you here because, like as we were saying before, there's a lot of students who are interested in filmmaking, and we've explored so many different things, but I think, the conversation we'll have today can be a bit different in terms of covering some of the things about business and finance and sales and your past. So Geetika from our Miami group will be doing the interviewing. And anyway, Dimitra, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna pass it over to Dimitra, to Geetika, and I'm going to hide myself.
Alex, no!
And
Jessica.
Jessica, we need to have you mute yourself too. Thank you. And I'm going to mute myself and hide, and we will catch up in a bit. Thank you, guys.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Geetika Kataru. I'm from the University of Miami. I'm a sophomore. Dimitra, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me today. I'm really excited. So my first question,
having me.
Of course. And my first question for you is just, let's go back all the way to the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like? Did you have a favorite childhood movie?
So originally I'm Greek. I was my family left Greece when I was about 4 years old. I then moved to Belgium, and then from there to Luxembourg. I am what I think when the European Union was basically sort of like thought through in terms of what kind of citizens can be of the future, I'm one of them. So I'm somebody who very, very much identifies as European. So my kind of, I guess my formative young years, sort of from 5 and up, were spent in Luxembourg, which at the time, and still now, is a very, very small country. It didn't really have huge numbers of cinemas or theaters or anything like that. I think if you really wanted culture, you needed to leave the country. You needed to go to Paris or to Brussels. It was very small in that way. And I think, and my family wasn't particularly sort of, cinephile. I think they were all very intellectual, but not particularly cinephile. So I grew up with movies that were playing on French television, which were all mostly dubbed. So, so I think most of my experience of early films were, basically, I'd watched sort of, the epics of things like Gone with the Wind and all those kinds of things with my family, because those were the sort of movies, but again, in French. And then I think my first memory, I think, of going to the cinema was probably to see Out of Africa, Sidney Pollack's film. And that was, I mean, maybe I'd been before, but I think that's really the first time that I remember sort of being in a dark room watching this thing on screen, and Robert Redford, and anyway, the whole, it was quite a magical experience. And then really, I think from there, I think I started kind of, I knew I was always kind of interested in the arts. I always really liked, and particularly I think when I was younger, it was music. I was very much into music, and I thought that, but I was growing up in an environment where I wasn't sure, that those jobs were around for people like me. I thought that, those jobs would have been for other people, so I never really, so I think as I was growing up, I just enjoyed the arts more so than anything. And I think when I arrived at university, and when I arrived in the sort of like, the decision-making time of my life in terms of what am I going to do with it, I felt like I wanted to be an enabler of arts, because I was just like, I quite enjoy it. I don't think I'm one person, because I didn't even necessarily think those options existed at the time. Yeah. And I'm like, maybe I can do something around it, So
yeah, I really relate to a lot of what you said. I was born in India, and my parents moved to America when I was around the same age as you, like 4 or 5. And I think the immigrant family, I feel like, really like pushes like intellectualism. And so when I was a kid, I was like, oh, like actors are completely different. Like people in the movies, like that is so far removed from what I could possibly do. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, like, what did you do in college? Like, what did you study in college? Do you think that really prepared you for what you do now?
So I studied law. So, which I'm sure you're probably, I think and really it was because I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I didn't really have a dream of becoming a lawyer, nor did my parents, to be honest. It wasn't, I think I could have chosen something different if, they would have probably been okay with it. But because I didn't know what to do, my parents said, oh, do law. And then the worst that can happen is that you've got something great to fall back onto, it's like, so I was like, okay, I'll go and do law. And so I went to the UK, and in the UK you can do law school as undergraduate. So you don't, so it makes quite a change. I think you're on mute, by the way.
Oh yes, yeah. I was just saying, like, I am actually doing the same thing. Like, I'm currently in political science classes with my film classes. So my parents were like, oh my God, you can go to law school if nothing else works out.
Exactly. So, so I, and I guess I kind of, I went to university, I was quite young. I was 17 when I started. And and I was in the UK, I was in a different country to my family, and I just, and it was kind of quite wild, I think, I just quite really enjoyed meeting lots of different people who did all these things. And, for the first time, we were lucky, I went to a university called Warwick, and it had a really, really good art centre. So we were lucky because we always used to get really good bands coming to play, and we had movies sometimes sort of stopping, as part of the release sort of schedule coming to Warwick, and aside from whatever sort of cinema club we had. And so all of a sudden I felt like all this artistic vibes around me, which I'd never really experienced before when I was younger, I think, and so, and also bearing in mind it's all like pre-internet days and so on. So, I mean, so you had to actively go and seek these things out. You couldn't, you couldn't stay at home and find them. So it's, so yes, I think it didn't really prepare me necessarily. I mean, actually, no, it prepared me for a lot of things. It prepared me for the fact that it made me realize that I never wanted to wear a suit in my life. It was a decision I made very, very early on. So, so when I graduated, I knew I wanted to do something with the arts. I didn't quite know how to go about it. I'd moved to London. It was the most amount of people I'd ever seen in my life, because Luxembourg is tiny. So I think there were more people in the tube that first morning that I went than the entire city of Luxembourg. So, it was quite a culture shock in many ways. But I sort of found that there was so many pressures around to go out and get a job, and I just needed a minute. So I actually went and worked in a bar. And I worked in a bar which so happened to basically be right next to a record label, and loads of people for the music industry used to go there. And from there I met a whole bunch of people who later on, somebody basically helped me get a 2-week internship in a small law firm, which basically predominantly sort of like had their clients were predominantly sort of DJs and record labels and things like that. So no suit involved. And the 2 weeks became 2 years, and that was kind of like my first sort of, my first proper job. And even though it was in a legal capacity, and I just, and I kind of, but at the same time, I just started, it was very, very close to the artist, as opposed to being in a huge law firm and a huge established thing.
Yeah, very different from corporate law. So
very much so.
Like, now I'm wondering, like, okay, so you started out at like a record label and you're working with musicians. Where did you transition from that to like going into the movie industry? Like, where was the connection?
So, and this is, I'm going to show my age. So Napster happened. So around that time. So I mean, it started before, but this is really, I think, where all of a sudden MP3, like, file sharing and stuff had basically kind of gone, really sort of mainstream.
Yeah.
And we were, and, the law firm I was at, their clients were predominantly electronic music. And electronic music was one of the first ones to basically sort of being ripped. So I remember going from, you know, having like mini celebrations for somebody signing a single to a record label to all of a sudden, like, you know, gone. There's no money, you know, like there was just that the whole industry basically changed very, very drastically, quite quickly.
Yeah.
And I think by then I'd also started, you know, like I'd started really learning a lot more about cinema. So I started, you know, I started becoming more of a film buff in my own time. Like I was, you know, there was this great video store called Prime at the time. So you had Blockbuster and then you had Prime, and Blockbuster was obviously all the kind of bigger movies, and Prime was all the art house movies and very director driven. And you'd go in and there'd always be some, you know, film lover behind the counter who would love to just, you know, explain to you all the directors and the history and so on. It was kind of like a personal version of I guess a Criterion sort of collection situation. And so I'd started really like learning a lot about film and really enjoying it. And so around that time, I basically started, you know, the company I was at the time, so the law firm, was shutting down in London, was moving back to a smaller town, Brighton. And I think another time, I sort of like somebody basically sort of recommended I speak to somebody that works in a film company. And I said, well, I don't really know anything about film. And they were like, that's okay, you'll just learn, you know. So I said, okay. So I went for my interview, I got the job, and I guess that's how it all began.
Yeah.
And, you know, I found myself working in film finance, which I knew nothing about, but you know, through a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights and a lot of just, you know, weekends and so on, I just I got up to speed quite quickly.
Yeah, and that goes to really show like what you do and what you learn about in college. Like I feel like almost everyone that I talk to who's successful right now, it's just not the same thing that they learned in college, and it's just stuff that they threw themselves into once they got to that position.
Yeah, I think for me in the end, because I did sort of like, I started in business affairs roles. So I did use, you know, so I ended up qualifying as a lawyer and so on. So I did actually use a lot of my kind of degree in my first jobs. But I basically, you know, but I had kind of like catered it to what I wanted it to be. Do you know what I mean? So I took the route that, no, I wanted to work in that industry more so than I wanted to be a lawyer. And it just so happened that I was able to then just basically end up doing the two things as a parallel for a while.
Yeah.
And,
So
you know,
go ahead.
No, please.
While we're on the topic of like your early career, I really just wanted to jump in right here and ask you, like, do you have any advice for students who are currently trying to break into the more like technical aspects of film, who are just dipping their toes into that right now?
When you say technical aspects, do you mean production, or do you mean sort of what would?
I meant more like the business side, the more legal side of things.
So I guess, gosh, I think with to me, all these things, I mean, obviously the legal side is a bit different, because usually you have to have a formation. And I think it's, you know, so I think the way that I did it was really quite unusual in many ways. So I'm not sure that it's basically something that I can say as a blueprint that it is. But I think in terms of the business, I think it's just a question of just being curious and figuring out, you know, which companies basically do things a bit differently, and just also just like finding out a bit more about, you know, all the different aspects. Because I think for me, for example, at the beginning, I had no idea what, you know, I barely knew what a producer did. And to be frank, sometimes today I'm still questioning what a producer does, but, you know, but because there's so many different roles that can fall under it, and you've got so many different types of producers, it's a minefield. But, you know, but I think understanding what's what, and what does a buyer do? What does a distributor do? What does a sales agent do? You know, all these things I think are really key at the beginning, because it just helps you then figuring out what it is that, you know, which areas you might want to go into. I think, you know, if you like the idea of business, you know, there's obviously the sales world is really interesting, because you kind of get to see a bit of everything.
Yeah. Speaking of sales, you were doing like a lot of stuff at in sales in your early career and like in protagonist pictures, I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit like what your role was there in that company and how that job looked like for you.
So by the time actually I got to protagonist, it was later on in my, I mean, you know, it was a few years ago, but it was later on in my career. So I was chief operating officer when I was there. And I was also basically spearheading the production side of things. But because I'd basically sort of, before then I had worked in a number of different sort of finance companies and so on. And so for me, one of my main things is that I wanted to get closer to filmmakers, the process of making films. And so I kept reinventing myself from job to job to a certain extent, because I think otherwise it's so easy to get pigeonholed. And I think that's one of the biggest sort of things that I will say is like, unless you're in a role in a company doing what you absolutely love doing and you think that you want to be doing sort of different things, never be afraid to just basically sort of say, stop, I need to move somewhere else because I need to fulfill more of what I want to be doing on a day-to-day basis. And I think, and so by the time I got to protagonist, I was like, you know, I didn't have to do legal stuff anymore, which I knew I wanted to sort of like leave behind. And I was, you know, I was essentially running the company on all the business matters of it. Obviously I had a CEO that I was reporting to, and I guess the company itself, I think it was interesting because it does, I mean, sales companies can be involved in so many different ways. They can help you sometimes, you know, sometimes it can help with development, because a lot of them these days also can fund development. Sometimes they can help you with casting. You have a budget level that you need to sort of, you know, that you need to make a movie for. You need to find cast that will help you support that budget level. So, you know, you can get a lot of back and forth conversations happening with your sales agent. And then they can help you finance the film. You know, they have usually so many different contacts with financiers and distributors. So, you know, if there's pieces of the financing plan that are missing, there are people that can help you find it. And sometimes there are people that can maybe put the money in themselves. And then, you know, and then obviously then, you know, production, okay, you may sometimes get comments from them during your edit, but usually you don't really hear too very much about them until it's time to then actually go and sell the film or launch the film at a festival. And then you have the festival strategy, which is, you know, I mean, obviously these last 18 months, maybe not as relevant, but in general, it's a very, you know, festival strategy can be very key for a film, you know, really thinking through which festival to go to, how to, you know, and particularly when you work on the non-US side of things, I think thinking about how you launch something in the US and how you launch something international is very important.
Yeah, so that was a lot, touching on everything from like the beginning to like the end of the film. So your role within that, I just kind of wanted to ask you, like, what is the balance between like the logistics and business and the creative aspects of it? How do you find that balance?
So I think back then I would probably say that we were less involved in the creative, and my role was less involved in creative, unless other than on I guess on the sales side. On the production side, because we were starting our own kind of development slate and stuff, and that was basically you know, so the team was within my sort of like my remit, and I guess in there was obviously a lot of kind of creative involvement. But I think on projects of others, so for example, you know how I met. Actually, I'd met Kevin before, but you know, but how I got to work with Kevin was on the Florida project, and so, you know, it's obviously we didn't have creative input from the Florida project. They had a great team as it was. They didn't need anyone else's help, and that was not what they were looking for. I think, you know, where we sort of like came in and helped was very much about positioning the film internationally, listening to what the filmmaking team wanted, you know, how they want, you know, the kind of distribution that they had in mind and so on. Because, you know, because that's the other thing is like, you know, you also strategize about how are you going to distribute your film? Should you go to a platform? Should you go to independent distribution? You know, what's the best way of, you know, of basically getting a film out there, which is both for an audience standpoint, something that can be great, but also for the filmmaking team. Some people, you know, they love cinemas. So some people want to have theatrical, you know, so it's all those things. So I think in the sales agency, I think unless they're films that the sales company is also producing, I would say that usually the creative role or the creative involvement in the project tends to be quite limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So quickly wrapping up our conversation on sales and business, I just wanted to ask you really quickly, what do you think is the most like difficult aspect of that role? Because I feel like that isn't talked about as much, especially when I'm as a film student, I'm taking all of these directing, production classes. And do you have any advice for navigating that sort of business and sales side of things?
So I think the biggest, there's challenges on both sides, I think. So if it's your project and you're looking for a sales company, I think sometimes the biggest challenge is to find the right company, because you have a handful of companies that will be the sort of the top tier companies, and they're all great, but they might not be right for your project. It might be that, for example, so I think to me, it's always like, look at the company's slate, look at what they're doing in that moment in time. Does it fit? Do they have something that's very similar? Which actually will end up, so if a buyer is choosing between one or the other, then all of a sudden you're finding yourself in competition, So it's more, I think, so yes, I mean, obviously the reputation of a sales agent is very important, but I think it's also just looking at what they have at that moment in time. Does it make sense for your film to be there? Will it be lost because they, for example, if it's a sales company with lots of bigger titles and you're doing a smaller film, will it be lost in the whole kind of thing? Or maybe because it's the only small film, it might actually stand out. So it's also, so it doesn't mean that, being somewhere where it doesn't seem an obvious fitness is necessarily bad. I think it's just about assessing, looking at the slate, assessing it, and just basically figuring out the pros and cons and thinking about it in that way. And so I think that would be my sort of biggest tip in terms of finding your company, and also the challenge I think that producers may have with it. Mm-hmm. And on the other side, I think the challenge is finding projects. I think these days the marketplace is changing, pre-buys are changing. I mean, I think, the theatrical was in a quite difficult situation before the pandemic. And I think since the pandemic, I think, the streamers rule. So, yeah. So it's tough. Personally, I believe in theatrical. And I think that, there is, as great as it is to watch films on Netflix, it isn't the only way to watch films. And I think the cinema experience of being in a room with strangers, watching a movie,
reacting to it at the same time.
It's a difference between passive and active to me. When you're watching a movie in the cinema, is active. It's an activity. You are engaging. Mm-hmm. When you're at home, sometimes it can be active, but more often than not, it's a passive experience. You're there, you've got your phone, you go off, you make a tea, you come back, your takeaway arrives. I mean, it's very rare that you'll say that for 2 hours you'll be totally focused on what you're watching at home.
Yeah, so, exactly. Especially because I'm in my dorm right now and my roommate is like 2 feet away from me at all times. So I'm like talking in between. And I'm like, okay, can you help me microwave my food? Yeah, there's just too many distractions, and I really do miss that theater experience. So yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about when in your career did you shift into the more production aspects of it? Where did you shift into that more creative side, being more hands-on with the project itself?
So I think the early steps would have been a protagonist, because that's where we started sort of having a development slate and stuff. And then really it's when I moved to Pulse Films. And so I was running the film division there. And so Pulse is quite a big company. They have they have a number of different divisions. They basically have the ads, which, they've got most people, I'd say, within the company works in that field. They have documentaries, they have they've got non-fiction, they've got unscripted, they've got scripted, they've got TV. Anyway, so it's quite a large sort of spectrum of projects that they have. And I think with film, so I came in and we had a number of films that were in the slate ready to go. And, so one of them was Mogul Mowgli, which was the first time that, so it's with Bassam Tariq, so it's not his first feature because he's done documentaries, but his first narrative feature. And with Riz Ahmed, and I think, and that was, and so that was the first project that basically sort of like went off on the slate. And and I guess it was the involvement, I mean, from my side, it's interesting because it wasn't all particularly, I would be lying to say that it was creative, because it was such a brainchild between Bassam and Riz. They didn't really, it was very much sort of stories that felt extremely personal to them, and they worked together in sort of like, in terms of figuring it out. But it was a very sort of close process, and it was wonderful to sort of see a film like that sort of come to life and come to screen, because it's super. I mean, it's going to come out in the US at some point soon, but it's super ambitious for a first time film, and I think they did an incredible job at meeting that. And I think it's quite a unique experience, I think. And so yes, I think Pulse was probably where, really, I think the kind of also my drive for producing also really sort of like ignited a lot more, because then I went off and produced Pig in Portland. So that was kind of, so I basically, I had, I guess, I just upped and moved to Portland for about 4 months, which was great. And I really loved it. And, and it was, and it was really fun to produce a film in the US, because obviously things work a bit differently, and there's it's always kind of, it's always interesting to see how different countries basically do things. But it's for me it was I loved the experience. And all of a sudden then I just kind of like, for me that was the moment where I was like, actually, you know what, I think I'd like to do a bit more of this. That was
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so funny that you brought up Mogul Mowgli, because I was like literally going to ask you about that later in the interview. Riz Ahmed, genuinely obsessed with that man. His music always feels so personal. And I know the American and the British experience can be a little bit different. And he's also Pakistani, and I'm Indian. So there's like slight differences, but just that the essential of just how personal and how honest he is in all of his work. I'm just so excited for that to come out in America.
He is. He's I think one of the smartest people I've had the chance to meet, let alone work with. I think he has an incredible way with words, and he's just a super kind and very generous person with his time and his and his words, really, frankly. I think, as you say, his music is great, and he does, I think there's quite a bit of it in Mogul Mowgli, and he has. Yeah, he's very unique, and I think it's been good, actually. I think this year, personally, I think it's Riz's year, because I think he did a fantastic job with Sound
of Metal too.
Sound of Metal, and and I think so it's been quite nice during lockdown to have all these little radio shows where he pops up and speaks, and so it's actually just been, for me, I think I've really enjoyed sort of like having moments of just Riz basically appearing in various different shows and stuff. So yeah, it's been good.
He does deserve that hype. I actually was curious a little bit about Pig as well. What would you say is the biggest difference between producing in America and in Britain?
Well, the guilds, to start off with. I think that's for sure. I think it's just, I think so I think it's that everything is a lot. I mean, the guilds are so much more organized in the US, I think. And so they have, it's not necessarily more organized, they're differently organized. And so I think the, sort of getting my head around sort of the rules, particularly with crew, because usually, I think when you work in the UK, you often will work with SAG or you work with DGA, because actors or directors may come over here and work, and they still want to work under union rules. But crews, I think, was something very different for me. So I think just to kind of get my head around how all the different locals worked, and and how the who could do what and who can touch what equipment and all that kind of stuff, I think was quite an interesting an interesting experience.
Yeah.
But it was, to be honest, I really loved it. And I think our crew in Portland was fantastic. And I had the best time. I really loved I loved the shoot. I think it was a really, really fun shoot, even though we're sort of, low budget, had to kind of, had to do everything that we could do to try and get within our means. It was a really fun place to shoot. I would do it tomorrow in a heartbeat.
America would love to have you again, for sure. So I kind of wanted to ask you again about the difference a little bit between going from protagonist and pulse. You mentioned before how like those two roles are connected, that they play into each other a little bit, but what would you say was like that transition, like from going to like this more like numbers, business, legal, to like more creative, and did that help the previous roles you played? Did that help you into stepping into what you are now?
I think with producing, you kind of, every aspect can be important at some point or another. I think that's the thing. It's like, there is very few people that you can basically say, I'm only a creative producer. If you need to know the business of film a little bit around it, unless you work on a studio a lot and you basically have, you develop, and then Warner's basically pays for the production. But even then, I feel like most producers have a very sort of like quite a lot of knowledge of how business, legal, distribution, all these kind of aspects work. Mm-hmm. Because there's a few reasons. One is at some point or another, a financier would entrust you with their money, right? So so you could be working on a script with your director and your writer. At some point, you're going to go out and you're going to say, okay, this is going to cost us $3 million. We need somebody to finance it. And the financier will need to feel that they can trust you with it. That you'll know what to do with it. And you may not know everything. It isn't about knowing everything. I think, it's the biggest advice I would ever give to somebody is never be afraid to ask, when you don't know something, but always figure out who the best person to ask is. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you could go around in circles with never really getting an answer. But it's okay not to know. And I think no one is expected to know everything. And particularly in production, you end up with so many different challenges on a daily basis. And you can't be an expert on everything, God no. But I think it really helps having a sense of, how to basically, how to put the business side of things together, what it means, who you should work with, who are the people that you basically need to bring onto your team so that you can gain the confidence of the financier. Do you know what I mean? So for example, bring on a great line producer, a really good production accountant, figure out what are the areas that you don't really know, and build the team to basically sort of help you buff up those areas. That's the kind of, I think. And so for me, when I moved then from more financing kind of roles, because I guess when I first started, it was very much like pure finance roles. And then I went on and worked in companies. So, at some point I went to set up the film division at Swarovski, so the crystal company. And I moved to Austria to do it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a bit random. It was great. I really loved it. It was a very different experience because, you were in this company who predominantly basically make crystals and jewelry and so on. And, and they wanted to have a film division. And so it was fascinating to work within that environment, because even though I guess it was very, because it was, I think for me also the first time that my role really expanded a lot more into creative and production. And I think it was interesting for me to sort of see, a different aspect also of how how you can make films and what it means to basically make films with the eyes of a brand, for example, and all those things. So, yeah. And then I guess, and from there I went to Film 4, which again kind of brought me a lot closer to filmmakers, because it was, even though they're a financing company, they're very involved in development, they're very involved in production, they're very involved in the way that the films are sort of, in the edit and the cut and finally sort of released and so on. So they're more of a partner rather than a pure financier. Mm-hmm. And I think that was, and again, sort of brought me that a little bit closer to production. So I feel like you know, so I guess all of my previous jobs in one way or another, each one of them kind of brought me that little bit closer to filmmaking teams and understanding the process and seeing how they work and so on. And so by the time I kind of got to Pulse, I was very much, I was like, okay, well, you know, yes, my background is very much for being a sort of an executive, so to speak, but actually I had worked and you know, much closer with creatives all along the way to try and really understand what their process was, and you know, and how I can find myself basically being more engaged in that.
Yeah. I thought it's so cool that you were working with a more the commercial side of producing too, and working with that. Would you think that's like a lot different than the more narrative things that you've worked on?
So I guess my role there was very much about trying to find films that, I mean, you know, Swarovski had a very interesting idea, which I think was, how do you take the legacy of a company from, you know, working with the studios? I mean, they've basically been sort of working in production and costume design for years, since cinema began. I mean, they are very much, you know, they're very present in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And so it was very much about how do you sort of take this legacy and actually sort of make films which aren't about the brand, but somehow basically sort of, you know, align with what the brand stands for and what the values are of the company. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting. We did do a film while I was there. It was a Romeo and Juliet version of, but we shot in Italy, so it was fantastic. We spent wonderful. It was a great sort of like shooting experience. The film sadly didn't really work as well as we would have hoped to, but it was a great cast, and it was beautiful to sort of, you know, have the opportunity to shoot in Italy. But it was, you know, but I think that's what they had in mind. They had in mind trying to find sort of like, you know, maybe interesting projects that would go along. And I think, I mean, I left after the film was finished, and I think I'm not sure if I know that they had some developments in process, but I don't know if they continued, or, you know, I'm not quite sure where they went from there. But it was interesting to think a bit more in terms of like, okay, well, how can we make a film and then potentially sort of just do a jewelry line alongside it? Or how can we make a film and then sort of just try and kind of, you know, use an existing sort of like, you know, an existing organization to support the P&A of it, or to support the distribution, or to support the advertising, or, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it was interesting to see, it was interesting to think a little bit in that way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that sounds like a really cool experience. Italy's so high on my bucket list. I would love to visit one day. I did so many art history classes in high school. Seeing that art in person, that would be so dope.
I'm sure you'll get there at some point.
post-COVID one day.
And it's got a really good sort of cinema legacy. So you've got, you know, it's a great place to shoot and good crews, and, you know,
so what my next question for you a little bit delves more into what you do now. So as you mentioned this before too, but I think production is a bit of a mystery for a lot of people. You put on so many hats that it's really hard to describe it in a concise way. So what does like a typical day for you look like when you're in the middle of a project, in the middle of a production? What sort of roles do you fill?
So, well, I think it's interesting because there is, again, it will depend on how, you know, so on who else is around. So I think if you have a creative, so for example, like I work a lot with creatives and you know, within sort of like creative teams as well. So for example, so my role will usually, you know, be making sure, you know, so I think everything from, you know, during prep and figuring out HODs and getting their deals done, and, you know, working with the legal teams to kind of get all of that stuff done. More often than not, I think, because I'm also, you know, my background comes from being able to close finance, you know, I'll do that because it just makes sense for me to do it, as opposed to having somebody who may not have done it before do it, you know. So I will also basically sort of like handle these things. I think, you know, when it comes to the day-to-day of production, it will depend again on what's required on set. You know, if you've got a very strong sort of production team, that's, you know, you're a very strong line producer and a good AD, and, you know, your director knows what you're doing, you don't need to have a producer sort of around kind of like just telling people what to do. I also believe that it's like there's a hierarchy on set, which is very important to kind of like respect, because I think if you have too many people trying to mingle, it doesn't really work. And, you know, and I also sort of believe that you have to have the trust in your sort of like in your kind of line producer and PMs and stuff to be able to kind of let them get on with their jobs, rather than having people bypass them and go to a producer who doesn't really necessarily always know what's going on, you know, sort of like in that sort of detail on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's, you know, so I think for me, so for example, at the moment, I don't have a production that's happening. So I think, you know, I'm in development on a project, which we are sort of, you know, just on the starting the second draft on. So it's quite a nice place to be, because, you know, you don't have, you know, we're not having to deal with shooting under COVID. But for example, I also, you know, but I've also sort of like helped at times, because I consult as an EP at times on films, where I come in and I help them either raise a bit of money or help them sort of like close off their finance plan. I think one of my skill sets that I guess I've acquired over the years is I understand European co-productions. I think my European self, and because I like working in Europe and with Europeans, means that I've learned how to you know, but there's a lot of people that know how to navigate it a lot better than me, but I understand it and I know where to ask the questions and how best to navigate some of these systems. So I work a lot with people who want to work between Europe, US, UK, and who basically want to find that bridge and how to sort of communicate, sort of, you know, and how, because everyone has their own heritage in film, and they're also their own ways and practices of working. I think what's sometimes difficult is the communication, and I'm not quite sure why, because, you know, but often I think, you know, people are sort of, they're set in their ways and they like to do things in a particular way. So when they go, so something that can seem super obvious to an English or to an American producer in France, they will just think it's hugely offensive, and it's just not the way that you do things, you know. So, but it's more, so sometimes it's just about understanding these things and just, you know, and kind of digging in, you know, to try and kind of get answers as to why that is. And then there's always a solution to it. I mean, co-productions have happened, you know, for years. So I think it's quite a nice, so I think at the moment, for example, my days are also occupied to working on some of these projects, which are not originated by me, but I find it quite fun in helping others kind of like, you know, put their projects together.
Yeah. And you've talked a lot about like working in teams and building that team and also leading them. And you have taken on quite a bit of like leadership roles and executive roles as well. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what have you taken away from leadership positions, and what sort of advice would you give to someone who wants to like step into those leadership positions?
Well, sometimes you're only as good as your team is. So look after them. Like literally, they will save you. And I think it's, to me, especially when you go into leadership roles, it's you don't always have all the answers, and you don't always, you know, you can't. It isn't about sort of forming people in your, you know, mirror image. I think it's much more about sort of finding people who can also, that you can also learn from, and who can again sort of basically be, you know, who can also be complementary to you. Do you know what I mean? And it doesn't mean because somebody's more junior that they can't be complementary to you. I think far from the opposite. So I think, to me, I really love working in teams. And I think, you know, when you have, you know, and when you have a sort of a team of, and especially sort of, I think, protagonists, for example, I hired some people when they were quite young. And it was really good to see them sort of within 2 years, like just the difference, and the, you know, from going from not really knowing how a sales company operates to all of a sudden just basically coming up with ideas to how you can basically change certain things. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant to see that. And so from, you know, so I think what I've taken away is that I think just, you know, personally, I think working, you know, it has its challenges, and, you know, it's not always easy because of course you have, you know, you need to listen to other people's ideas, which sometimes you want to do, sometimes, you know, your mindset isn't there to do that. So you have to respect other people's ideas, and sometimes you have to do things that you don't want to do, or you don't think that it's the right course, but, you know, you decide as a team. And but when you're in leadership roles, I think you just also, you know, for me, it was very much about sort of what I learned the most is that actually being able to find the right people to support you means that you become better at your job. And they can also basically flourish because people are given a certain responsibility and a certain kind of, you know, empowerment. And I think those are the sort of, you know, those are to me the most important things. I think if you can find complementary people that can be empowered with tasks and make you look great, I mean, happy days. Like, you know, it's like, you know, everyone is happy, and, you know, and then you can operate in a much more efficient way. So, you know, there we go. So I think, you know, that was, and then the other thing I'd say, when you do have a team, make sure you kind of look after them. Sometimes the little things make a big difference. So, you know, if you can take them for a day at a festival at some point, or if you can, you know, it just makes, I think it's just being able to kind of give credit to where credit's due, and opportunities to also just start meeting people and going out to the world by themselves, I think is always a good thing to do.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. We actually have a question in the question and answer box right now from Max Jones. He asks, how do you balance giving creative input versus taking a hands-off approach and giving the director creative freedom, and in reference to your job as a producer?
So I think it's an interesting question. It's always a fine balance. I think there is, I personally believe in giving, you know, I think as a producer, you can give guidance, and you can basically have conversations, and you can challenge certain ideas or certain things, and start having conversations. But at the end of the day, you know, maybe because I see things as a European, I believe that, you know, if I wanted to direct a film, then I should be going to direct the film. I think at some point you have to sort of also respect the director's vision and say, either I'm backing it or I'm not backing it. But I don't think you can go off and sort of try and kind of constantly try and change it. I think you have your development phase is basically the phase where you know, spend your time in having those discussions. And then of course, you're going to have millions of those discussions at the edit. But if you don't start off with a common vision at the time of the development, by the time you get to the edit, your vision is definitely not going to be the same. Like, I think that's the, you know, so I think it's, I think there are moments where you have to sometimes sort of question, should you be the person producing this project, you know?
Yeah. And my last question for you today is more of a personal one. So where do you see yourself going in the next decade? Like, where do you think you're going to go from here?
So, so I think basically at the moment, I am in the process of setting up a company with a couple of partners. And so it's very early days, and, you know, not much can be said about it and so on. So, you know, so I'm sorry about that. But I guess I'm hoping that in, you know, I guess in 10 years time, we'll still be working together, and we'll be having some fantastic projects under that company. I feel like it's in all my roles, I think there's been a natural point where I've wanted to work for myself or to work with other people.
Yeah,
I think I feel like my time working for other people has basically, you know, run its course. And I've enjoyed it, and I've loved it, and I've learned a lot, and it's really nice sometimes to have the stability of a salary and so on. But I feel like this is a good time to just branch out and, you know, and start building, you know, my own thing, and start working with people rather than for people.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a very big shift. Going from, yeah, doing something just for yourself and independently and on your own. What sort of advice would you have for venturing out on that? I think you're frozen right now.
Gosh, I don't know. I'll tell you. It's
Okay, you're back.
sorry. Okay, so I think if you when you want to venture on your own, I mean, it's you can do it in so many different ways. If you're, like projects can take a really long time to get off the ground. So think about what kind of source of income can keep you going, because even if a financier pays for your development, they might give a tiny amount towards a producer, but it's a very small amount, and that's not going to allow you to sort of to live. And so I think always basically think about what else can you be doing while your projects are, and ideally do things that feel that are part of the industry, so that you can also keep learning, keep expanding your contacts and so on. I think if you have the possibility to work, to consult or work part-time for a company while you're developing your projects yourself, then, those are to me quite quite good ways of doing it, because it means you still kind of keep an eye as to what's happening sort of around you. And the other thing is, producing is very lonely. When you're an independent producer, it can be super lonely. It can be, you can find yourself being super introverted, and it's kind of like, and I think it's good to just make sure that you're out and about and speaking to like-minded people, find maybe even a group of producers who you can exchange ideas with, and you might not work with them, but feel, like a set of trusted people that you could potentially, ask advice at times, and vice versa. So a little network which allows you to basically not feel that you're constantly on your own or have to deal with challenges by yourself, and then a little trusted team of people. I think those are God sent. I feel, I've had a few of those people in my life, and they are really God sent, because they are the people that that you can call up and sort of, that it's not going to go any further, and that they can, when you need a little bit of clarity in what to do next on something, they can be a really helpful source of wisdom.
Yeah, for sure. Building that support system. But those are all the questions that I had for you today. Thank you so much for talking to us and giving us your advice. I'm going to shift it back over to Kevin, and thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Dimitra, thanks so much for doing that.
Hi, how are you? I'm good. How are you? You're looking so fabulous, as always.
It's so fun to hear all these stories and all these little gems. And Francesca and I were just saying, it's funny because, film school will do a great job of teaching people where to point the camera, but they don't teach them how to get the money to rent the camera. Right. I mean, it's really a big part of what is missing, sometimes, not maybe all the time, but, and so it's the business side is so important.
Yeah.
Cinema is an art, but it's also a business, and,
it really is. I mean, it really is. And I think, I'd say, honestly, that's what I was saying about always find the areas that you're not good at and just hire well in these areas, because they're going to save you. I mean, a good production accountant on set, it's like worth their weight in gold. It's the basic difference between having savings and going over. I mean,
Well, and it's funny too, because, you're saying when you talk about we've talked about this in other calls, it's like trying to describe the different things that you're responsible for as a producer. It's almost
like hot costs.
Yeah. It's like, so you're sort of like
a good accountant. Speaking of a good accountant,
But it's crazy. Yeah. There's just so many elements, and so it's
there's too many to even recount. And I think that's the thing, is you can also, and then sometimes you're also responsible for the job that somehow no one is responsible for.
Correct.
So all of a sudden, you're there just doing something totally random because no one else is there to do it. And so you can have sometimes the most glamorous thing, and sometimes and then you have the agents. God, we didn't even touch upon the kind of the managers and the
Diplomacy,
agents.
Right.
Yeah, we talk about this, like going, a job in the UN is a good job for a producer following her work,
Absolutely.
It's funny because I just think, when you think for trying to tell people the kind of work, to just realize, and you kind of said this also, how there's just so many different things, like your path has been like ours, there's so many different steps, and one door you open takes you to another door, takes you to another door, and you're like collecting little bags of skills as you go along. And, for anybody to think that you're going to know it all, even today, I mean, we're constantly, just even the conversations we have back and forth with each other, we pick your brain on things, you pick our brain on things. It's like the normal process, even at this stage, because it's also constantly changing. But
and there isn't, and I think that's the thing, and on the creative side, I think it's kind of, it's been interesting to see the films this year, because I think, it's been, because we haven't had the blockbusters, because they've all been sort of pushed and waiting. It's been actually a year where a lot of the independent films have been on the forefront. And to me, this has been a vintage year for foreign language films. I mean, fantastic year for foreign language films. And it's basically, and I think, and usually, I mean, I like to watch them in general, so I watch them a lot. But I feel like this year there's been some fantastic contenders and films that I think are hopefully going to get to audiences because, because it's actually, they don't have the competition of the bigger films this year. And so you can actually sort of like get them out there. I mean, all the films that are in the long list between the Oscars and the BAFTAs, I mean, are fantastic. And,
we're actually, next weekend, we're going to do a Q&A. We're going to watch The Life Ahead and do a Q&A with that director.
It is a wonderful film. It is a wonderful movie. I loved it from the beginning, middle, and the end. Sophia Loren, exceptional, and it's fantastic. I really loved it. I think it's probably that and White Tiger, I think, are the best two films that Netflix did.
So we're gonna do a Q&A with Eduardo next weekend. We'll record it. It'll probably be late for you, but we'll record it so you can watch it. But
yes, definitely, I would love that.
I know. Well, listen, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I hope it's been useful.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. And Geetika, you did such a great job.
Such a great job. You were such a great interviewer. I love you.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, again, because it's what's wonderful is that we have a nice library, and and it's different. We haven't interviewed someone with this kind of experience, and I think
it's so great.
People, like students, probably don't think about the path of a distributor or a sales agent, and it's such a great path. Like, you can learn so much about what people want to see and the business side of it. I mean, it's such a great path for people to learn from, so for people to be able to watch and to learn from that will be great. So thank you very much.
And all the movies you get to see. It's almost like, on the development side, and people read scripts, and there's so much that they learn from that, but also to see, I mean,
and assessing the movie and what works.
So many more movies than we've ever seen. It's incredible. And exactly what works and how it's
the funny thing is, when you go from a sales company to then a production company, you almost feel like you've stopped, because there's a constant rhythm that happens in a sales company, because you go from festival to festival to market, and it's just constant. And so you read a ton of scripts. I mean, I wasn't in acquisition, so luckily I didn't have to screen all the scripts. I just could read the ones that we were considering. And then we'd have like so you basically, everything that's going on in the market, what everybody else is doing and what they might be launching. And so, other people's projects too. Then you sort of go to festivals, and you have teams that kind of go out and watch all the films to try and sort of scout for new talent. Right. And so then you basically, you know, so it's kind of like, and so when you go to a production company and all of a sudden you're working on like 3 or 4 projects, you're like, what? Wait, I've basically gone from working on like, you know, having 40 different titles kind of like running around my head at the same time to like 4. It's like, it's kind of,
the pond becomes much smaller but much deeper.
Right.
It is, but I think for a lot of
rushing river, you're like in a rushing river,
right.
you know, and also like you're in the middle of the artery, like you know everything, all the information is coming.
It's
yeah. But that's the thing, is that when you stop and you move to something different, you almost feel like at some point you kind of like, oh, am I, you know, you have like what I was saying about the loneliness. It's also the relevance, because you've gone from basically being in this sort of the artery of things to all of a sudden just being in your own corner working on something. You're like, wait, if it, like, you know, will the world even remember it existed, kind of thing? Like, you know, it's a very
in production, it's a black hole. You know, it's like you go to Portland and you like put on your email, I'm in production, I'll talk to you in 4 months.
Right.
It's like, I know when we made the Florida project, I mean, we had 1 day off that entire summer, and it was Francesca's birthday.
And it was,
literally, I mean, it was the only day that we didn't work.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. I think when I was in Portland, I spoke to, you know, my husband was in the UK, and so time difference and everything else. I mean, I think, you know, I said to him, like, I'll send you the occasional text message, but, you know, I think it's fair to assume that, you know, I will, it might take us, you know, and then you get home and then you're exhausted. You're just kind of like, you have like ridiculously long days, and you have the idea, you know, barely are able to sort of just take your shoes off before you collapse, kind of. But you know what, I love it. I do really like it, and you kind of create a really nice family on set, and it's really
it's always a great fun experience. I mean, we're excited for everything that you're doing. I can't wait. You know, we'll have to have you back on in a year to recount the stories.
Yeah, well, you know, and then you can also have and then I think, you know, my business partners are quite interesting too. So I think you can have some fun with that too.
Well, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to see you guys over the pond.
Yeah.
Or Dimitra, come to Miami, since Christine is now living here.
Yeah.
I heard. She sent me a message to tell me that she'd moved to Miami.
Yes.
So, I mean, well, as soon as they let us back into the US, I think at the moment we're sort of, you know.
Yeah.
But yes, I'll be there. As soon as they let me, I'll be there in a shot.
Yes.
Well, great to see you.
Great.
Thank you so much for having me. And,
of course.
And thank you to everybody. And yeah.
We'll talk